Good evening, everybody. You're very welcome to this latest event by irishborderpoll.com. Thank you for being here. There are 540 people that have signed up for tonight's session, so I think that's a great response and testament to the fact that the debate about Irish unity is gaining in urgency and pace. Just a few housekeeping points, if I may, and a bit of an introduction. Our aim at irishborderpoll.com is to promote debate around Irish unification through writing and events like this. We are entirely volunteer-led, and I mean that in the literal sense, not in the Irish Republican sense. The team tonight is myself, Sean Hickey, and Harley Richardson. Harley's working in the background, making sure that the event, all the tech side of it goes to plan. So thanks to Harley and to Sean, who's going to be helping with some of the questions, triaging some of the questions and helping us to feed those through to Brendan. Kevin Rooney, our editor and organising force, can't be with us tonight, but I know he will be watching, so my best to Kevin and to his wife as well. Tonight's discussion will be posted online tomorrow. Thanks to Harley for that. Please do subscribe, if you would, to the irishborderpoll.com website so we can keep in touch with you about future events. After all, this is a very much a grassroots-led initiative. We're only as strong as the numbers of people that we get at our events, and we are gaining in numbers at every one of them. So that's absolutely fantastic. We welcome your feedback as well. And tonight is a question and answer session. So if you want to participate and join in, if you could put any questions or any points that you want to raise with Brendan in the chat box, and then Sean can triage some of those and feed them through to me, and we can ask them and get through as many of those as we can. We'll do as much of it as we can over the next hour or so, but we may have to composite some of those questions, which is an old trade union term for amalgamating things. And finally, for those of you on Twitter, would you mind tweeting out any comments or observations using the hashtag #IrishBorderPoll, all one word? That would be great, so that we can showcase to the world of Twitter what we're doing. So it's a great pleasure tonight to be joined by Professor Brendan O'Leary, the distinguished political scientist, historian and author of 30 books, innumerable book chapters and papers, many of which are about Ireland, particularly how we repair a divided society and find a working accommodation. Brendan is Lauder Professor of Political Science at the University of Pennsylvania, honorary member of the Royal Irish Academy, and honorary Professor of Political Science at Queen's University in Belfast, among many other accolades in a long and distinguished career. Brendan has also worked for the United Nations and was formerly an advisor to Shadow Northern Ireland Secretaries Kevin McNamara and Mo Mowlam. His most recent books include a celebrated 3-volume study, A Treatise on Northern Ireland, published by Oxford University Press in 2020. But his latest book is titled Making Sense of a United Ireland. Should it happen? How might it happen? And that's why he is here with us tonight. Brendan, you're very welcome.
Thank you,
if I may just start off by perhaps it might be a fairly obvious question, but if Irish unity was a horse race, how long is the field, and what are the hurdles that we've got to jump over, and are they surmountable?
Well, I think the length of the field to the referendum is somewhere between 7 and 10 years. Consolidating a united Ireland will obviously take longer than that, and I have no expertise on the far future.
So it's very much in scope then.
Indeed. In my view, however, what's critical in the period ahead is adequate preparation, particularly by the Government of Ireland, but also by political parties, civil society organisations, and initiatives such as your own.
So I mean, you called in your book for the creation of a Ministry of National Reunification to be set up in Dublin, and also for a sovereign reunification fund. Obviously, Ireland has an abundance of good fortune at the moment economically. There seems to be a little sign that anyone in Dublin is moving towards that. Is that your assessment, or do you sense that actually
I have no information to the contrary, Kevin. Sometimes ideas take a while to percolate. In my view, nothing less than a ministry of reunification is appropriate. The South Koreans have had one for, I think, 30 years. They have a much harder prospective reunification than we do. I had the privilege a long time ago of supervising the PhD thesis of a South Korean student on comparing the position of women in the two Germanys and the two Koreas. She has since become the head of the women's unit of the Korean Ministry of National Reunification, and they have extensive plans for the possibility of a sudden, unexpected moment of reunification. They also have plans based on accommodation. So if they can plan, I see no reason why we can't. And given the enormous scope of the consequences of Irish reunification, I think a ministry would be in order. In the way I would envisage its role is not as a standard ministry, but a ministry in which the relevant government minister would be at cabinet and would be charged with considering the implications for every single legislative measure and policy measure that goes to cabinet for the long run consequences for reunification. I'd also see them as charged with the responsibility of preparing a national unification plan that could be modified as and when parties in the South, after consulting citizens and parties in the North, choose to modify it. So I don't envisage them building a completely inflexible plan, but I'd see that as their primary responsibility. The second thing you mentioned, a sovereign wealth fund. There was a sovereign wealth fund before in the Republic. It was crushed by the weight of the collapsing Celtic Tiger. I think it's quite clear that the Dublin government is going to generate some general sovereign wealth fund again. It would make prudent macroeconomic policy at the moment not to engage in extensive tax cuts or extensive public expenditure, though there are many things that cry out for attention in the Republic. My argument is, if the citizens of the Republic are serious about reunification, and generally they indicate by 4-1 that they favor unification, why not put money aside now for its prospective use to cover potential costs of reunification, some of which I think are exaggerated, but this would be a necessary, in my view, and wise, prudent preparatory measure. I made the suggestion in the company of Minister Michael McGrath at a conference recently in Cork. He smiled, he came up to me afterwards and he said, if I recollect correctly, you do realize, Brendan, that these are projections about budgetary surpluses, forecasts. I said, yes, but I think they're very reliable forecasts. He smiled. That's as far as I can tell you. His thinking has gone on the matter.
Do you sense there's a level of complacency in Dublin about unity? I mean, if we're talking of something that's perhaps 7 or 8 years away, that's, you know, in terms of central government planning time, that's not actually a very long period.
I think there's complacency among some of the traditional parties of government in the South. I detect also a kind of straightforward party political fear. They have managed to persuade themselves that Irish reunification is a Sinn Féin question, rather than a question to which all the parties elected to the Dáil are in principle in favour of, and which they know the bulk of their voters are in favour of when tested in surveys and polls. I think they're reluctant to embrace the necessary consequences of thinking about reunification for two distinct reasons. One, they think it's camping on Sinn Féin's ground where they'll lose. And secondly, and let's give them credit here, I think they fear that raising planning for reunification will act as an obstacle to the successful resurrection of the northern institutions and the north-south bodies. Now, in my view, because the Good Friday Agreement allows both for the continuation of Northern Ireland under a power-sharing regime within the UK and for the possibility of reunification, it's entirely appropriate for the Government of Ireland in particular to prepare for both possibilities. And as I put it crudely, having learned the phrase in America, it is possible to walk and to chew gum at the same time, namely to prepare for reunification and sincerely advocate the resurrection of the northern institutions.
I mean, if that's the sort of, in a sense, the responsibility that lays at kind of Dublin's feet, what about Westminster? What are the equivalent moves or choreography that are required from the British government?
Well, it's not clear to me that Westminster has very extensive obligations to prepare in the way that the Government of Ireland has. But I believe there are certain measures that it could take, which it hasn't taken, that are consistent with the text of the Good Friday Agreement. As we all may recall, the Good Friday Agreement contains a phrase under the very important constitutional provisions requiring both governments, requiring the incumbent sovereign government to be rigorously impartial between the two major traditions and all other peoples in all their diversity on the island of Ireland. And I think it would be vital to incorporate that into UK domestic law. And the reason I would argue for that is that this is not mere pabulum. It was a treaty commitment, and it was put in there to ensure that the government of the UK would be rigorously impartial in running Northern Ireland in those parts of government functions that are still basically under Westminster's remit, and in possible mediation of difficulties with the parties in the north on a whole range of questions. And we saw during the post-Brexit referendum period how easy it was for the government in London to abandon any semblance of commitment to rigorous impartiality. If that was put into legislation, it would dictate the way the civil service prepared business for ministers, and it would act at least as a check on their behaviour. That's one provision that I think could reasonably be asked of an incoming Labour government. A second is that the Good Friday Agreement requires respect for the right of the Irish people, north and south, to exercise their self-determination, quote unquote, without external impediment, unquote. So who is the potential external impedimentor, if I may invent a phrase? Well, the answer to that is quite obviously Great Britain and its institutions. So it seems to me that any fair interpretation of the Good Friday Agreement requires a future UK government to be extremely careful not to have any British interference in the exercise of Irish self-determination, in the planning running up to a referendum, the referendum campaign itself, and in the implementation of the referendum. So I think these are things that the UK could do under the terms of the Good Friday Agreement without necessarily having to act as a persuader for Irish unity, as we know traditionally Sinn Féin used to demand. So I think those are things that could be done and consistently asked for. They would, so to speak, create the level playing field and the possibility of a protective Irish public space for debate about unification as and when referendums are called.
That's great. I've got a couple. I'm just looking at the chat box. We've got a question from Stephen Clark, which I think is probably quite pertinent. What does Brendan think will change in the next 7 to 10 years that triggers the border poll? What conditions will be necessary or sufficient for the Secretary of State to judge that a majority is likely? Would that be a mixture of opinion polls, elections, census, or anything else? What's your reflections on that, Brendan?
It's a very good question. And here I think we have to distinguish between a legalistic answer and a political answer. The legal answer is that under the Good Friday Agreement, the Secretary of State calls a referendum if in his opinion, and the language is traditional sexist, if in his opinion, opinion has shifted in favor of Irish unification. So what would trigger that opinion? It's not clear from the legislative text, and so far UK governments have refused to clarify that. It seems to me obvious that elections would matter if Northern Nationalists had a majority in the Northern Ireland Assembly, or if they had a plurality and the Alliance Party thought it appropriate that there should be a referendum and there was a collective majority in the Northern Ireland Assembly that favoured a referendum, it would be extremely difficult for any UK government to resist that request. Likewise, if there was a majority of MPs returned to Westminster who have a majority of the vote in Northern Ireland, and those MPs say they would like to see a referendum, that too, I think, would be extremely difficult to resist. There's an element of absurdity here because the Secretary of State is expected to be able to predict not only that he thinks there's been a change in opinion, but in effect, the consequences of a campaign, which is impossible to predict. So a set of surveys showing support for unification running at 52%, maybe 53%, allowing for a margin of error of 3%. If those were good quality surveys, I think that too would be very strong evidence that a poll should be called. Now that's a legalistic answer. It seems to me unlikely that any Secretary of State would initiate such a poll without consulting with his or her cabinet colleagues. And my current fear is that the Scottish question right now interferes with the exercise of Irish self-determination. It had always been my view that it was more likely that Scotland would become independent before Ireland unified. We have to suspend judgment, I think, on that question at the moment. But the reason I raise it is I think that in a very important sense, the Labour Party, and to a lesser extent, the Conservative Party, is committed to the Union of Great Britain far more than it is committed to the Union of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. And that means that the Scottish question weighs heavily on whether or not to call a reunification referendum on Ireland. Legally, it shouldn't. It should be entirely dependent on Irish opinion, North and South, the views of Irish political parties, and electoral and survey evidence. I could go on, but I'll stop because it's a question that which does not allow for any easy and satisfactory answer.
Okay, I'm just looking at the chat box. There's a few questions. I will do in my best trade union style. I will composite some of it, and I think some of it alights on the point that we've been discussing about losers' consent, about if there is a border poll, when there is a border poll, when there is a result, if that result is 52, 55% for Irish unity, that leaves a lot of people on the wrong side of a decision that they don't like very much. And you reintroduce this concept of losers' consent. I mean, from your experience, not just I suspect in Ireland, but more generally, more wider in terms of the work you've done with the United Nations as well. Tell us about losers' consent and why that's important and why it's not a veto.
Okay. Well, first of all, let me emphasize, Kevin, that losers' consent is not some re-expression of the idea of a veto. Any democratic process, whether it be an election or a referendum, to work smoothly requires the losers, and they are called losers, to accept the result and to consent to its consequences. Some would prefer the term losers' acquiescence. I prefer marginally the term consent because if you want to win a referendum, if you're wise, you prepare the ground to give the losers as soft a landing as possible. You don't give them a veto, but you think about their interests, you think about their identities, you think about their ideologies, and you think carefully about what will make it easier for them to live with the result. That's the core idea behind losers' consent. So a winner thinking about how to win a referendum has to focus, in my view, primarily on mobilizing the base, making sure that in this case that the model of a united Ireland is one that people can recognize as a model of a united Ireland. And they can't make too many concessions to the prospective losers that would lead to the supporters of unification abandoning their enthusiasm for the project. But again, it is possible to walk and chew gum at the same time, namely to keep your base and at the same time work hard to achieve losers' consent. So let me elaborate this with an example that some people may find helpful. If you look in survey evidence at what unionists emphasize particularly if they're the hardline category who say in surveys that they would find unification almost impossible to accept. What would ease their concerns? Not make them happy, but ease their concerns. Top of the list by a very strong margin is being able to preserve their British citizenship only in the event of Irish unification. Now, that's already allowed for in the Good Friday Agreement. It would create some awkwardness in the Republic of Ireland because you'd have a body of people with only partial citizenship rights. They wouldn't be able to vote on constitutional amendments. They wouldn't be able to vote in elections for the president unless they took out Irish citizenship as well as their British citizenship. That's what they emphasize most of all. If we look at it the other way around, many people have tended to say, oh, it's terrible that Southerners aren't prepared to contemplate changes to the flag or changes to the anthem, and that means that they're deeply uninterested in any kind of accommodation of the future losing minority. Well, when you ask Ulster Protestants what they think about whether a change in the flag or a change in the anthem would do to their opinion about a united Ireland, they basically respond with, meh, it wouldn't make any difference to them. What does that signal? It means that if you are interested in winning the unification referendums, you should tamper with those subjects very, very carefully and perhaps not be concerned to change those matters if they're not going to make any difference to unionist opinion. Instead, focus on the things that would make a difference to their opinion. And there are at least two of those. One is the British citizenship question, which I emphasized already. The second is the possibility of preserving Northern Ireland as a devolved set of institutions under full Irish sovereignty. The third, they appear to quite strongly like secular education. And integrated education rather than have denominational education in the event of unification. So those are three subjects on which people can at least spend some of the next couple of years thinking about in some depth.
Okay, thanks for that. We'll come to Sean and some of the questions in a moment, but if we can just respond back and say, in terms of being able to articulate unionist concerns and what unionists want, and there's obviously different ways that can be determined, polling, or all kinds of evidence gathering ways. But the missing element, it seems, is of course political leadership from within unionism. Now, you made the point, I think last week on The View, and I probably said this myself, that actually, there's not much point being a unionist politician if you start to talk about the end of the union. It would seem slightly perverse. So it's a difficult situation, if you're being generous, for anybody in the DUP or the UUP to have to kind of broach these subjects, really. But it is a missing element, is it not? That the people that we would expect to talk to say, okay, if this is to happen and if it's to be successful, tell us the kinds of things that you want, and we'll make sure that's factored in. That kind of tribune, that ability, that conduit to the unionist community is missing because it will not take a seat at the table. Can we get around that?
Indeed. And my view is if the unionists came and asked me to advise them as a constitutional consultant, I would tell them the same thing, not to engage, because you'll demoralize your base. So therefore, demanding that they engage is, I think, to show some lack of respect for their own position. As you say, there are other ways of evaluating what their followers think through surveys, focus groups, structured conversations, multiple invitations to participate in conferences. There are all sorts of ways that you can ensure that you know what the underlying public opinion is of the unionist community. And we have to accept the reality that their leaders might fear that they would be accused of being Lundies the moment they opened conversation about the prospects of United Ireland. It is significant that Peter Robinson talked about the possibility of United Ireland after he had retired. He would not have raised the subject when he was in office as First Minister. The thing that I think strategically those who favour unification need to think about is as follows. If you hold a referendum in the north and you follow it with a referendum in the south. That's one possibility. Or you hold a referendum simultaneously. Perhaps we'll talk about that subject. But if you hold a referendum in the north and the unionist leadership has not engaged on the model of a united Ireland, that creates difficulties for afterwards. Maybe if they had engaged, it would have been possible to tweak the model of a united Ireland in a way that would make it easier for them. So what I think is possible is the following. For various reasons that you can explore with me if you want, I think it makes sense to have a detailed model of united Ireland put before the electorate. And if after the referendum, it's clear there's been a vote for unification, it could be possible that that detailed model has two sets of provisions. This is definitely going to be part of a united Ireland, unquestioned. Yeah. These provisions are definitely going in. And then there might be a series of other provisions that would be left open for ordinary legislation as opposed to constitutional amendment, where the government of Ireland would then engage with the leadership of the losing side of the referendum to see what could be done to mollify their concerns. So that would be one way of treating their leadership with respect and creating some avenue for post-referendum result negotiations.
Thanks for that. Just looking at the comment here that I think reflects what you were just saying there from Dennis. Does Brendan think the Brexit experience will make people wary of big change without a lot of planning and structures in place, especially in the south?
Exactly.
Quick thoughts on that?
Well, what we found in this is work I've done with John Gary, who is neutral on the question, Jamie Poe, who I think is also neutral on the question. What we found in the deliberative fora that we have held on these questions is that the Brexit experience has burnt everybody, Northerners and Southerners, equally. If there is to be a future referendum, they all say, we want to know the detail. We don't want to vote on principle. And if you take 5 categories of voters, hardline unionists who say they would find unity almost impossible to accept, ardent Republicans in the South, ardent Republicans in the North, and the undecideds, all of them say by strong, distinct margins that they would prefer to vote on a distinct model of a united Ireland rather than to vote on principle and to negotiate the details afterwards. So my advice to anybody who wants the referendum is, if you want to lose the referendum, have a vote on principle. If you want to win it, have a vote with some detailed institutional planning.
Yeah, thanks for that. Sean, over to you, sir. Have you got a few questions that we can put to Brendan?
Yeah, just on the policies that we were talking about a couple of questions back, there's been 1 or 2 people in the chat mentioning the idea of amending the Southern Health Service as kind of a sweetener to unionists or those who are apathetic to the question in the first place. I think for myself, I'd go even further to say that it could be maybe a new structure of housing system in the South as well, because I know from work that I've done in the past with millennials and Gen Zs in Northern Ireland from the Protestant Unionist Loyalist community, they have actually, that's something that's cut through a lot more with them rather than things like flags or anthems or languages. It's tangible aspects of day-to-day life. But more broadly, I think there's been a lot in the chat about the economics of United Ireland. One particular question was to do with how the economic benefits can be made clearer, I suppose, or more at the forefront of the debate to kind of to nullify the political and ideological questions involved in it. And I was minded actually reading that question of what a previous Irish Border Poll event where we had Stephen Farry, who was saying that as Alliance, their position is to have no position. And it was more or less they'll cross the bridge when they come to it on what their constitutional stance would be. But I wonder, would it be would it be a position for Alliance to take to kind of to go on those practical levels and adapt themselves to see, okay, is it economically beneficial for us to become part of this new union with the Republic of Ireland and ourselves? Is it more economically beneficial for us to and have a purely pragmatic approach to it rather than an ideological one?
Thanks, Sean. I see three separate subject matters there. They're linked: health, the economics of unification, and the Alliance Party. On health, and I don't claim to be a health expert. On health, it is clear that the Northern public love the principle of the NHS, the idea that healthcare will be free at the point of need and there will be no direct charges. And in focus groups, I've seen sometimes inaccurate discussion of the amount of expenditure that people have to engage in the Southern health system. And it's also true that if you ask people in the South whether they like a model of socialized medicine in principle, there's high levels of support for that. That would lead many to jump to the conclusion that healthcare based on socialized medicine, absence of charges at the point of need, would be a very successful and winning formula. However, we have to take very seriously, I think, the evidence that the NHS model is an outlier in Western Europe, and it's subject to a predictable political difficulty of what I call a feast and famine model. Crudely, feasts under Labour governments, famines under Tory governments. And that makes it hard to sustain with successful outcomes. And maybe there's a case for a universal health insurance policy that does cover everybody who needs to be covered, but also make sure that those who have the ability to pay do pay through their insurance scheme. So I would be personally indifferent between a socialized model, funding out of general taxation, and a model based on compulsory universal insurance. Both, I think, can achieve the health goals that we collectively might want to see accomplished. That said, I think there's a very important amount of public ignorance that needs to be resolved. The health service in the North is not performing. The indicators clearly demonstrate that life expectancy is greater in the North than in the South. Now, you might say that life expectancy in the South is better because they're richer, and despite their health system, you might want to make that argument, but I think it would be a little tough. The Southern health system is performing better than its domestic critics suggest. So there's room in this territory for compromise, and to my mind, it is heartening that the Southern parties in Parliament, at the initiative of the Social Democrats, agreed the policy of Sláintecare, which is a program for systematic change in the direction of more socialized medicine. So you're absolutely right, Sean, or whoever posed those questions, that's a very important topic to raise. So if people know that they will have a good healthcare system and it won't be significantly more costly for them, that will be, I think, to the benefit of those who argue for unification. The warning I would give is this: in countries like the United States, where I live, when large numbers of people have already been introduced to private insurance schemes, they then worry that the introduction of some new universal scheme might lead to a loss of advantage to them and their families. And that becomes a subject of sustained campaigning by private insurance companies. So thinking about this question with great care, with strategic care, and alive to the politics of private insurance interests is definitely something that everybody who's interested in Irish reunification has to focus on. The economics of reunification. Two things here. One is it's almost impossible to exaggerate the success of the Irish economy in generating radically increased productivity, in very high levels of GDP per capita. The Irish economy is higher in GDP per capita than the United States. Even when you strip out the effects of globalization and the tax strategies of international companies, Ireland's performance in gross national income is exceptionally good. The distribution of income in the Republic, though far from ideal, is significantly better than in the UK. So one thing that needs to be done is to enhance knowledge of the performance of the Republic's economy in the North. And here there's a difficulty. I notice Mitchell McLaughlin is in front of me on the screen. Sinn Féin is a party that is very successful in the South in opposition. It criticizes the performance of the government of Ireland. That's what oppositions should do. But if Sinn Féin is giving that message of potential negativity about the Southern economic performance, that's heard in the North. And that has the effect of disabling the project of unification in the North, or potentially could have that effect. So if over the next number of years, Sinn Féin is part of an Irish coalition government, obliged to defend the performance of the Irish economy, maybe there'll be a greater sync in the messaging from the same party, North and South. I do think that there is a section of the public that fears what I call the valley of transition. Imagine that you believed, for good reasons, that you would be better off in the Republic of Ireland as a citizen, and your family would be better off. But imagine also that you think that to get there, you have to go through a very painful process of adjustment. You fear that Irish reunification might be like German reunification was for East Germany. Then you might fear that your trajectory would be to go down significantly before you went up. And I call that the fear of the valley of transition. I think that exists, and it's particularly pertinent among the large number of Northern nationalists who are employed in the public sector in Northern Ireland, who might be fearful that they would be made redundant in the event of a united Ireland. So what is to be done there? I think that's part of the thinking behind a sovereign wealth fund. You need, if some rationalization is to occur, if the strategy is to have an integrated Ireland rather than a devolved Ireland, then some careful thought will have to be given to the restructuring of the public sector. But I do want to end on a positive note. West Germany was poorer than the government of Ireland, than Ireland, sovereign Ireland is today in 1989. East Germany was significantly worse off than Northern Ireland is today. Northern Ireland is by no means a stellar performer, but it is not a total basket case. And the argument is no longer that the Republic cannot afford unification. Rather, the argument has become that the Republic won't be willing to sustain some of the costs of transition. Now, I think if those costs are planned for and carefully catered for, then the public can be won. Lastly, the Alliance Party. It plays a vital role in a divided place like Northern Ireland, bridging the two traditions. The moment it makes a decision one way or another, it will split. And it will, on the question of unification, we know from surveys, its voters split three ways. Some would say in the event of a unification referendum, they'll vote in favor. Others say they will vote against. And then there are the undecided. I think if it becomes plain over time that the Republic, through membership of the European Union, through being a site for very extensive high-tech investment by American companies, is a much better economy to be part of than a United Kingdom, which has made the deliberate decision to exit both the single market and the European Customs Union. If it's clear that being part of the Republic is better than British prospects, then I expect the Alliance Party's voters over time to move in that direction. If you look at the social profile of Alliance Party voters, guess which Southern party they look most like? Anybody have a wild guess? It's Fine Gael. They're both economic liberals and social liberals. So they're not particularly fearful of the consequences of entering a more dynamic capitalist economy. What they're not yet persuaded of in the case of alliance voters is that Ireland offers a clearly better alternative to staying in the UK.
Thanks for that. Just to pick you up on the German unification example, you write about that in your book. You also write about, as an example of a successful integration, reunification of a country. You also write about Cyprus, and that being an example of one that doesn't work. Would you just perhaps flesh out the kind of the two examples and the key elements that you think made the German experience work, and why it didn't work in Cyprus? That would be quite interesting.
Well, what made German unification work most easily was a shared conviction that wir sind ein Volk, we are one people. There wasn't in Germany a large section of the community that identified with another nationality. There were historic religious differences in Germany, those persist, though East Germany is fairly secularized. But having a shared national identity made unification easier. The German government also had a model of incorporation on the basis of the West German constitution. The East dissolved itself into the West. It voted to do so. However, retrospectively unhappy East Germans were about that decision. At the time of unification, that was thoroughly endorsed by the East German directly elected parliament. So they started with high levels of legitimacy. Even though there was, they did some very foolish things. They obviously had to have monetary integration, but they gave a ratio of 1-to-1 for the East German mark to the West German mark. That had the wonderful consequence of protecting everybody's savings inside East Germany, but it had the downside of making all East German companies immediately uncompetitive on world markets. Now, because of the pre-exchange, because the sterling and euro basically are internationally competitive currencies that float freely on global markets, I don't anticipate the same problem in our case. Though there will have to be some kind of guarantees given to people who have savings in sterling and the conversion rates at which those will occur. So fundamentally, the biggest problem in German unification, in my view, was the overzealous transfer of West German officials in all capacities to govern East Germany. Including, for example, running the universities. So any West German professor who had not been particularly successful in West Germany suddenly had a new career in the East. And that, I think, was mean-spirited and insufficiently considered. Now, if we take Cyprus, Cyprus has more comparisons with our case because Cyprus is an ethnically divided island. What happened there was that the United Nations, I think, thought too much about making concessions to Turkish Cypriots. So the model of a united Cyprus would have been one in which Turkish Cypriots, roughly a fifth of the population of the island, would have had a comprehensive veto on Cyprus's foreign policy and possibly thereby giving Turkey a veto over the foreign policy of an EU member state. The Turkish Cypriots would have been overrepresented in both chambers of the Cypriot parliament, and they would have had an overly generous share of the resources of a reunified island. And that meant that at the key juncture before the referendums, the leader of the Greek Cypriots told the Greek Cypriot population to vote against on the grounds that in future they would be able to get a better version of unification, and on the grounds that they wouldn't recognize the successful state that they had built in the UN Annan plan. Now, by analogy, if a government of Ireland proposed a unification model that gave unionists extraordinary veto powers over the functioning of a future united Ireland, that would probably, and I know it would, judging by survey evidence, that would radically reduce support for Irish unification in the South. So I think we can learn from both these cases, both the German case, which in a certain sense was easier because there was no important ethnic division, and in the Cypriot case, we can learn from the fact that it's absolutely correct to consider the interests of the potential losing minority, but you can't do that at the expense of losing the overall majority that is needed to make unification work in a referendum.
Great, thanks for that. We'll come back to you, Sean, in a moment. Just one question just caught my eye from Finbar. On The View last week, Brendan, you mentioned the different media and information bubbles that both communities live within. What do you think could be done to address this, and what issues should be addressed? I'm always struck, and I always point out to British friends that when you go to Belfast, there are 3 daily newspapers in Belfast, which is absolutely extraordinary, given that I can't think of any comparison anywhere in Britain. I mean, I'm very interested on your thoughts on this, but if people are getting information and drawing conclusions from completely sort of different media, and there's a lot of confirmation bias, how do we overcome that?
Well, let me begin by telling you how unhappy my life is, Kevin. Every morning when I'm in Philadelphia, I begin my morning with a big cup of coffee, and I read the newsletter, and I follow it by reading the Irish news. I do that quite deliberately, so I'm aware of, quote unquote, what both sides are supposed to be thinking at this juncture. So we clearly do have a divided media. In the UK, the BBC is supposed to play the role of the impartial broadcaster and to keep in check some of the frequently ludicrous and partisan reporting in quotation marks that takes place in the tabloids. What I do think we want to mobilize for is to ensure that the BBC will be bound by rigorous impartiality, and that the UK government, as part and parcel of governing Northern Ireland under the terms of the Good Friday Agreement, irrespective of whether there's a referendum or not, that they take great care to ensure that the BBC is impartial across the viewpoints inside the North. At the moment, it seems to me, and I haven't done systematic study of this, but when I watch most of the programs in Northern Ireland, I exclude The View, which did include me and some others. But when I watch and listen to BBC media, most of the comparisons are intra-UK comparisons. They don't systematically compare the North and the South. And in my view, by doing that, they're doing a disservice to their constituents. They're allowing myths to survive. I think it's important that RTE take great steps to ensure that it's an all-island broadcaster, that it's available widely in the North, that they ensure as much as possible that they're a channel that can be easily and freely accessed by people who are not typically pro the government of Ireland. I don't have any easy remedy, but I do think that thinking through how you regulate the media and how you regulate public spending so that referendums are conducted fairly, these are not tasks beyond the wit of man. They're not my speciality, but I think a lot can be done in this domain.
Sure. There's just an interesting point that's just caught my Paul, just on this point. I'll just read this point out. I think you've probably covered it as just in an answer there a minute ago. This is a really important point. Both the North and South media are pretty poor at covering the other jurisdiction, other than as a novel, faraway place. The culture of partitionism within RTE certainly needs to be tackled. And I mean, it just seems often it's often a criticism of people in the North and people in the South as well, that RTE seems to sort of actively try and cut the North off and completely out of the equation, even to the point of doing it on weather maps. You know, is there a kind of, I don't know whether it's a kind of an ancien regime in Dublin that really, you know, just wants to keep kicking the can along the road for as long as possible, and we'll happily do it for another 100 years? Or do you sense that the kind of that kind of mentality is changing or has changed?
Well, it's certainly true that in both jurisdictions, meteorology and archaeology appear to be influenced by partitionist thinking, and that's deeply unfortunate. I think, to be fair, I have met many broadcasters, modern, recent broadcasters from RTE, and many newspaper columnists from the Irish Times who say they have to fight to keep their stories on the North because their audiences, they claim, aren't interested in the South. Well, I think it depends on what effort the relevant broadcasters or newspapers undertake. They can influence their readers, their audiences, and I think they could do better. But I do think it's a feature of virtually all media that they believe that the local is what people really want to focus on. And I'm not sure that's true, because most American big city newspapers chase themselves to extinction by going more and more local, cutting out their foreign correspondents, cutting out their Washington correspondents. So Philadelphia used to have 3 great newspapers. Now it's got one, the Philadelphia Inquirer, which is a shadow of its former self, and it has only one foreign correspondent who does the whole of the rest of the world. It's absurd. Now, Ireland still has some serious newspapers in 3 cities, Cork, Dublin, and Belfast. And I'm encouraged by the fact that the Examiner, even though its audience is historically Munster, is trying to make itself a national newspaper. The extent to which it covers the North, I'm not sure. I've seen stuff on the North there. But clearly, the general story is that we need to encourage the media to be more comparative. And there's lots of opportunities, I think, for interesting comparisons, including public health, how people managed the pandemic in the 2 jurisdictions, different patterns of housing crisis in the 2 jurisdictions. There's lots of both human interest and big public policy questions that can be addressed.
Wonderful. Sean, we'll go over to you, sir. What have we got from the chat box? Have you got a few points and a few questions for Brendan?
There was quite an interesting point made earlier on, actually, about the future of all political parties, for that matter, on the island. And I think it would have been during the answer about the Alliance Party, where this particular point was made, is that like the political philosophies of many of the parties, North and South, kind of blend over, separately from Sinn Féin, of course. And the question was more or less, in the 20, 30 years after hypothetical reunification, how do you yourself see the political landscape in an all-island jurisdiction changing? I just thought it was an interesting thought exercise for myself the last 10 minutes or so. So I'd like to hear what your thoughts on it would be.
Well, first of all, I think it would depend on whether a devolved government persisted in the North or not. If it did, I would expect the continuation of 2 party systems, North and South, with the difference that the Southern parties that are currently not organized in the North would now have a greater incentive to get organized or to become part of coalitions with Northern parties. In the event that the Northern Ireland Assembly is dissolved, there's an integrated Ireland, then I think we'd expect a different party system. There are 2 possible futures for Sinn Féin. It could be the largest party on the island and a party regularly in government. That would be the optimistic future for Sinn Féin. But it could also split, simply because the fundamental objective of the party, Irish unification, had been met. And there might be a division between those who have a more strongly socialist disposition and those who are not socialist strongly in their policy orientations. The interesting question would be whether Unionists and Protestants organized a British party in Ireland, or whether they chose to become members of Irish parties. Now, in the experience of the early Irish Free State, initially the Irish Protestants, former Unionists there, they did form parties like the Commonwealth Party. They formed some other small parties whose names don't immediately come to my memory banks. But there was a bit of an effort to keep separate organization. But then they decided that it was best, given that they were more conservatively oriented, to align behind Cumann na Gael and Fine Gael. So that led to generally the integration, at least of the upper class Protestants and many of the middle class professionals as well. And that's one possible future that might occur in the circumstances of Irish unification. We did ask Northern Protestants in one deliberative forum to consider whether they preferred the idea of an integrated Ireland to a devolved Northern Ireland. On first blush, most of them strongly preferred a devolved Northern Ireland. But I must emphasize they didn't like any model of a united Ireland, but forced to choose, they preferred one with a devolved Northern Ireland. And then they started to deliberate about that among themselves. One of their responses was to say, well, if a devolved government doesn't work in the UK, why is it going to work any better in a united Ireland? Some took that view, an unsurprising view given that the institutions weren't working at the time we held this forum. But some of them also considered the possibility that they would do better in a united Ireland if they were to organize as a party and have roughly 1/7 of the representation in Dáil Éireann, where they could be a potentially pivotal coalition partner. And what some of them clearly liked about that was that they wouldn't have to be second fiddle to Sinn Féin in the north. They might be a critical part of a southern and more conservative coalition that governed the whole island. So once these questions begin to open up, so I think party system dynamics might open up. It's not clear what future the Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael distinction would have when that would be 2 civil wars ago in terms of historical consciousness, the formation of those parties.
Smashing, thanks for that, Brendan. We've got it's coming up towards 8 o'clock. Are we okay to just perhaps a few more questions and then I'm very conscious we've bounced around all over this subject, and Brendan's not missed a beat, which tells its own tale of. I don't think there's anybody going to ask a question that he's not going to get a very good answer to. But could I just alight on the question of opinion polling?
Sure.
So you're involved with the ARINS project, which commissioned a poll that was published, I think, last December in the Irish Times, which showed that support for Irish unity vis-a-vis support for the status quo. The status quo was 50%. Irish unity, I think, was 27%. Now, there's obviously a big variance with some of the opinion polling, and other polls that have it much closer. And my observation would be, how can a poll like that be really accurate when we know from actual election results, even from 3 weeks ago, that the kind of nationalist share of the vote is 43-44%? How would you, as a political scientist, I suppose, account for the variance between some polls that have this very close and other polls, including the one from ARINS at Christmas, that have it miles away? What's going on?
Okay, I think I can explain it, Kevin, and I can explain it without any wishful thinking in either direction. First of all, let me briefly explain what ARINS is. It's analysing and researching Ireland North and South. It's an initiative of the Royal Irish Academy and the University of Notre Dame, as they say it in America. And our purpose is to bring together academics North and South to do research on the 2 jurisdictions, conscious of the possibility of Irish reunification, but nobody is obliged to endorse that. So you can think of ARINS as like the Alliance Party. As ARINS, we don't take a position on the union, though obviously, as this conversation has made clear, I personally favour Irish reunification. So that's ARINS. What gives a good answer to your question, Kevin, is the following. Surveys that are expensive and that proceed on the basis of face-to-face interviews using stratified probability samples much more successfully tap the disengaged and the elderly who are not online. By contrast, internet polling has become extremely good at tapping the opinions of the engaged and those who are likely to vote in local government, assembly, or Westminster parliamentary elections. Now, the reason this matters for our purposes is that if there is to be a unification referendum, we know that the results, the turnout will be extraordinary. Unless one side decides to boycott, and I hope that won't happen, then we will have turnouts minimally in the 85% range and probably as high as 90%. Some will immediately tell me that the dead will vote and they'll vote twice if they can. So that's important. It means that if, as I believe, the surveys that we've done, which we believe are pukka, good social science, based on the best current knowledge of how to conduct these kinds of surveys, if they're right, I think they're giving a better prediction of a unification referendum than internet polling will give you at the moment. What we see, and I, together with many friends, I reported this in the report that some of you may have read. It's a collection edited by Alan Renwick, the Working Group on Unification Referendums in the Island of Ireland. We show a graph there in which the survey results show lower levels of support for Irish unification. By contrast, the internet polling shows higher levels of support for Irish unification. And the Aaron's survey was not an outlier. I can tell you that confidently because at the same time, John Gary, Jamie Poe, and I conducted an ESRC-sponsored survey on the Northern Ireland Assembly elections. And our results were much the same. So what will change this? Well, one, as people like me age, we're fully internet fluent. So the time in which the elderly are unrepresentative of the rest of the population in terms of their digital fluency, that's going to go. The second thing is, if the internet polling companies become like the US ones and have huge panels, then they will be able to get more representative samples. At the moment, I think they're oversampling among the engaged and the same people, and that they've managed to be able to, I'm not going to say massage their data, they've been able to use their data to do quite well at predicting outcomes in the kinds of elections I've talked about. So I think this is an interesting question, but it has policy ramifications because obviously a Secretary of State who isn't minded to have referendums will like to focus on surveys, and one who is will focus on internet polling. A last thought. The Aaron survey, in my view, had an extraordinary result, and it's insufficiently remarked upon. And this is the difference between how I interpreted the survey and wrote about it in the Irish Times and the way in which Pat Leahy, the political correspondent with whom I'm very friendly, how he reported it. For me, the fact that 17% of the sample, most of whom are cultural Catholics by background, didn't know which country they wanted to belong to was extraordinary. There's little that's more fundamental than knowing what country you'd like to be part of. So that tells you that there's a very high level of persuadables. And it has to be part and parcel of a successful project of unification to work on the persuadables without insulting them, without disrespecting them. And having said that, I'm now going to use an expression which people do think disrespect such people. There's a category of those whom I call the wobblies. And wobblies are people who have sometimes favored Irish unification, then favored the union, and then go back to favoring unification. They wobble. And why should we think that all human beings are, just rigid on national identity? Some are obviously almost plasticine in their flexibility.
It seems extraordinary that you could have people with kind of such cognitive dissonance on this issue that they could hold these two completely contradictory opinions. I mean, given we can tot up, and you did a piece of work last year after the Assembly elections, coding all the candidates who were broadly pro-UK, broadly pro-United Ireland, and got the gap to about 6,400 votes in that contest last year. And it's a similar thing, of course, this year. But I mean,
so I'd like to report that Jamie Poe and I have done that exercise for this year, and we will be publishing a blog. And we think of these local government elections as a tipping point. It's the first time the combined vote of nationalists, whether measured in parties that officially favour unification or independent candidates who are identified as nationalists or Republicans, jointly, they come to 44% when rounded. And all unionists, whether in parties or independent loyalists or independent unionists, come in at less than 40%. That's never happened before. And that's a breakdown of 44. When you round, that's a breakdown of 44, 16, 40, which is not the same as 40, 40, 20, which is what people typically summarize the current situation in the North as being.
Yeah.
Now, one caution attached to that. It could be, though there are numerous intricacies here, it could be that nationalists were more successfully mobilized. They turned out to vote more than unionists. That may account for some of the difference. But even that, I would largely explain as part and parcel of the outworkings of Brexit and the ways in which parties have responded to that. So if you're a nationalist who favour Irish reunification, these recent results should certainly give succor and comfort. But no one should conclude from these recent results that a referendum would be a wise idea tomorrow morning.
Quite. I've just got two final points, if I may. One is I suppose, given the news this week about John Finucane going to the South Armagh commemoration yesterday, which has caused quite a lot of sort of comment over the last week. I suppose the general question is, how much is the past and what we remember or what we commemorate or what we forget, how much is the past an impediment to Irish unity is one question. And I'm also struck just in your book as well about, and I've wrestled with this myself in terms of phraseology. Do we talk about Irish unification or Irish reunification? And you very definitively talk about reunification. I'd just be interested in your thoughts on why you use that term. So just those two, if you perhaps to round off, and I'll just have a quick.
The second is easier than the first to answer. The reason I call it reunification is not just the traditional idea that the island was one administrative unit before the Government of Ireland Act in 1920. There's a rather technical point, which I think is important. In the treaty, Michael Collins successfully negotiated, along with Arthur Griffith, that after the treaty was ratified, the Irish Free State would be whole and unified. And then Northern Ireland could opt out or secede from the Irish Free State by making a declaration in the Northern Ireland House of Commons, which they proceeded to do. They took roughly a day to do it. But in that moment, the Irish Free State was unified. And the technical story I would like to insist on is that Northern Ireland seceded from the Irish Free State back into the Union. That's not the way the story is customarily told, but I would defend that interpretation. For that reason, I think it's legitimate to talk about reunification, even if you took a very British constitutional version of Irish history. The typical British thing to say is that the Irish have only ever been unified under British rule. Mm-hmm. So the other thing is, it's quite clear that for a very large portion of the population, nationalists, GAA supporters and players, there is a deep sense of a shared cultural continuity on the island, which of course many British Protestants don't share, but they do. And for them, reunification is part of the objective. It's being naturally part of Ireland as far as they're concerned. So I don't have a hang up on whether to call it reunification or unification or unity. These are practically equivalent terms. The tougher question you asked me is about the past. I think individuals vary. Some people have a brilliant ability to put everything behind them and just be forward focused. Sometimes people like that are almost psychopathic because they don't care about their past commitments or obligations or duties or wrongs. At the level of groups, I think it is impossible to prescribe amnesia. So from my point of view, I would say that the best we can hope for is that each will commemorate their dead in their own way and should be left to do that. And commemorating the dead is quite different from celebrating violence against others. And we should make a sharp distinction between those two.
Wonderful. Thanks for your thoughts on all that, Brandon. We've been going at this now for 72 minutes. So I think we'll draw things to a conclusion there. So thanks very much for your time. Thanks for sharing your wisdom and insight with us as well. We've got hundreds of people still on the call, which I think is a testament to the fact that this has been an enthralling hour or so. We've had tons and tons of comments and questions in the chat. Apologies, folks, if I've not managed to get to yours. We'll certainly pull all these points together and go through them, because some very interesting issues that have been raised as well, as is often the case with when people get going, they start to really nail a very specific question, and it's worth further elaboration. So my great thanks on behalf of IrishBorderPoll.com to Professor Brendan O'Leary. Everybody have a good night. I'm here in Sheffield and it's just about to start a thunderstorm, I think, so I may lose connection anyway. So have a good night, everybody. Thanks again for coming. Thanks again to Brendan. Thanks to Sean. Thanks to Harley. And we'll see you next time at the next event. Thank you. Good night.